Hey everybody, welcome to this edition of Government Class in the Time of Corona. Today's subject is going to be Congress. Specifically, we're going to be talking about how Congress is organized in the various, the differences between the Senate and the House, and how those differences do in fact create some differences in the way business is done. So today we're going to talk about this basic structure of Congress. Now I want to remind you about a few things that you probably already know. And that is that Congress is made up of two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. We call this a bicameral legislature, bi meaning two. All right, so House and Senate. Remember way back at the beginning of the school year, we talked about how the House and the Senate had different jobs, and they had different, the founders were after different things when they created the House and Senate. Remember that the House of Representatives is our most democratic chunk of government. This is where we have the most commitment to democracy, the idea of one person equals one vote, and we're going to make everything proportional to the population. And because of this, the majority rules in the House of Representatives as far as the country and the way the majority can exert power on the country in more here in the House than in any other place. And because the majority rules, that means that the large states that pay the most taxes and have the most people, they're going to have the advantage in the House of Representatives. Now remember that everything in our government is a teeter-totter. We're trying to balance democracy on one side and fear of democracy on the other. This idea that democracy and majority rule seems to be the only way to legitimately run a government. But at the same time, we recognize that when groups get together, they sometimes do bad things to the out group, to the minority. And so, just like everything else we've talked about all year long, so too is the Congress. We have democracy and majority ruling on one side, and then the founders were like, well, let's pump the brakes a little bit on this democracy thing and make sure that we have some protection from democracy. Of course, the small states would be the place, the group that would be worried about democracy getting overrun by the large states. Also, the Senate is a recognition that, hey, the states are important as states. If the House of Representatives is this idea that democracy is the way we want to run our government and rule ourselves, the Senate is the place where we recognize that the state is important as the state. We talked a lot about this in the past lectures over the course of the year about how the United States is versus the United States are is the way we refer to the United States, whether it's is or are, singular or plural, is a indication of the idea that at some point it was the states that were the primary primary building block, the primary institution in the United States. Now, to make these two groups have to agree, boy, stroke of genius. Because in other words, what we're telling you is that if a law is to, be written and it's going to be enacted, then both the majority and those who fear the majority are going to have some say in the process. And so essentially laws are very difficult to write in the United States, and that's by design. Now, the way we get to this, the founders realized that small changes mean big things. So the first thing we can see about the House and Senate and the difference and these democracy versus protection from democracy ideas is in the names that the founders gave. A representative in the House, a senator in the Senate. And if you think about it, the name tells you what the job is, and notice they do not have the same name. So that means they have different jobs. And if you just think about the name, this says that a representative's job is to represent, to do what their constituents want them to do what the people want them to do, represent the people. Whereas a senator, that's not what a senator is. A senator's job is not to represent. A senator's job is to do something else. So what is a senator's job? Well, if you think about it, the word senator comes from ancient Rome, and in the Roman Senate, it was the Senate who were, members of, they were elected, true, but they were members of an elite class of people, that it's the senator's job to run Rome. So in one way, a representative's job is to represent, but a senator's job is to run the place, to rule, and that's a different idea. So the two have very different jobs, and you can see this in just simply the names. Now, what we're going to show is how those two ideas, representation versus some kind of independent, we're going to run this place, whatever, regardless of how you feel about us, we're going to see how the ideas of the way the founders constructed the House and Senate reinforce this. So the first thing to notice is that there's a lot of people in this room, and that is the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives is a very large group of people. It's 435 people. This is contrasted by the Senate, which only has 100 people in it. And that difference between big and small is going to make a lot of difference when it comes to how people run. So this difference between 435 and 100 is significant. There are fewer jobs in the Senate. They only have 100 people. And therefore, compared to the 435, the jobs in the Senate are going to be harder to come by. They're going to be more exclusive. It's also going to mean that they're going to be more prestigious. It's kind of like the difference between a college athlete versus a pro athlete. There's lots of college athletes, but there's not as many pro athletes. It's harder, and you can assume that the pro athlete therefore is a better athlete. And same with the Senate. There are fewer jobs, and fewer jobs means it's harder to get, and harder to get means that in theory you're getting a better, more experienced person that is a member of the Senate. Now, on the representative side, because there are so many of them, we can divide the country into more little tiny districts, which means that those people, because there are so many of them, can get to know, the people from their district better, and that will help them when they do their job of representing, because they get to know those people. Now, we talked in past lectures and past times in this class about gerrymandering, and I want to remind you of gerrymandering, this idea that we're going to divide up we're going to make these weird lines. This is one in Pennsylvania. We're going to make these weird lines in order to choose the people we want to vote for us, rather than the people voting for the representative, and that this is an issue. We're not going to get into gerrymandering today because we've done that already before, but this is an issue. When you make lines, you're going to have these issues with the lines. So just a reminder of things we've talked about before. But basically, what I want to point out is that if the founders are trying to create a representational group of people that listen to the people, well, then they have to be divided into these smaller numbers, in these smaller territories with more people. And you see that in simply the number. 435 versus 100. Now, before we move on, there is no magical number. 435 is literally the number just because that's as many people as we had in the early 20th century in this room, when we realized that at some point we're going to have to put a cap on it, or we're going to have to get ourselves a bigger room. Before the early 20th century, basically every time the United States grew or a state grew, they just got another representative. Well, pretty soon you fill this room up, which if you've never been to Washington, D.C., this is really not that big of a room. And you realize that, hey, we can't fit 500 people. We can't fit 1,000 people in here. We're going to have to put a cap on it. And so that's why we put a cap at 435. But I suppose at any time, if we wanted to build a bigger room or something like that, we could increase the number to 500. But right now, the number is 435. Now, some things about this number 435 that change the way the group does business. The first change is that when you have this large number of people, 435 people, man, the rules about who can talk and when you talk and how long you can talk, these things are going to become really, really important. I want to imagine when you're in a class meeting in the Commons or in the gym and everybody's talking and the poor people that you elected to be your representatives can't get everybody to just shut up long enough to hear what people are going to, what they have to say. Well, unfortunately, adults are no better. And so you got 435 people in a room, and you better have some rules. You better have some, breakdown, so not everybody's trying to talk at the same time. You better have some limits to who can talk and when can talk. And so the biggest effect of having this large group, besides the idea that they're able to represent their district more, the biggest effect is that the rules are going to be more important in the House than they are in the Senate. When in the Senate, you got less people. Supposedly, they're more mature and experienced. And so everybody can kind of take their turn and talk. And we don't have to have as many rules. And so therefore, the first difference we'd like to talk about, as far as how these differences actually change the way the Senate is and House operate, is that because of the number of people in each group, it does change the importance of the rules. And here's where I'm going to leave you today for this lecture, is that I want you to remember that she who controls the rules controls the game. I want you to think about a game that you play, like an actual game. And if you know the rules and your friend doesn't, and you're trying to teach them or you're just trying to play, if you know the rules and your friend doesn't, then you're going to probably win. Because every time your friend tries to do something, you say, well, you can't do that because of these rules. If you control the rules, you control the game. Imagine playing a game of like Monopoly, and you get to decide that, you can or cannot buy that property, or you can or cannot just choose to ignore that fine or that card. If you control the rules, then you control the game. And that means that in the House of Representatives, he or she who controls the rules controls the game. And in this case, of course, we're talking about political party. And that makes the Rules Committee, which we'll talk about another time, the Rules Committee the most important committee in the House of Representatives. Because in the House of Representatives, where the rules are more important, he who controls the rules controls the game. And in the case of the House of Representatives, there's multiple ways where one party could control the rules. They could be the party that the Speaker of the House, who's the person in charge, comes from, or they could be, the one who controls the Rules Committee, or they control other committees that set the rules. And all of these things come from the same majority party, which is okay because in the House, we're worried about majority rule. And we can see how that works. Next lecture, we will talk about how this smaller number, beyond just simply prestigious stuff, affects the way the Senate does business. We'll talk about the term limits, as you can see, and the age. Until then, have a good day, and I will talk to you